Okay, for our young folk, you know, we were in the church and okay, even though this is the church, first Father Jerry is very open, active. Anytime I've been here recently, and he loves children to be in here. The top here was found as a window ledge. You can see in 1990 Ross Hill was excavated, okay, and there was these two main artifacts were found which point to the antiquity and the continuing faith right throughout the whole period of time of religious activity in the locality. So this is printed, okay. There is possibly, I'm not sure of the exact translation, I don't know if, it's on my paper it suggests that it's a follower of Brendan, okay, and it refers to moil, meaning bald. The monks were tonsured. Remember they had, you know, friar, whatever it was in Robin Hood, had this friar tuck, had the bald head and back. So it's indicating that it isn't just a follower like an ordinary person, it was a monk. So there's a continuation of this tradition of the early, a lot of the early saints would have come, they would have promoted religious activity. St. Brendan ended up in Annadown. He's supposed to have lived till he was 95, and he died I think in 492 AD, something like that. That's a very long period of time for somebody to live. Most people would have died in their 50s, 40s at that period. The writing on this is quite significant. It's definitely indicating antiquity, but it was reused as a window ledge. Do you see the side here? So it was pushed back in and the writing wasn't visible until they actually went in and excavated it and found it, okay? So this is an extremely important artifact, and in many ways it's good that it was gathered and put here, because in recent times things have been lifted, you know, away from locations. Once they come out of the location, they lose their context, they lose their history. So it's very important that it is retained. We also have, as an indicator of religious antiquity, out on Saints Island on Loch Mask, we have what looked like beehive huts and slabs with crosses. The way the crosses are shown indicates they're very early Christian church scribing on the slabs as well. So maybe dating back to the Coptic church. Now a lot of you will not be familiar with that, but it's the kind of early Christian church, say around Roman times. A lot of the religious, to escape persecution, they would have gone into the deserts for contemplation and to pray. And that tradition of going to distant locations for quietness and away from population continued in Ireland. You've heard of the place named Dysart? Yes? Yeah. Ever wonder why Dysart? I think it's a very peculiar name. Sometimes spelled D-Y, or sometimes D-I-S-E-O-T. That follows, it's early Christian again, the pattern of those early religious people going into the desert. So Dysart, desert, out in Egypt. Okay, so whoever got that right, I see somebody going, I know that is good, good. What today is about is stimulating interest of people in local history, because clonbur is teeming. I can't tell you how much there is. You could use clonbur as a history of Ireland, because there's as much happened around here as there did anywhere else. Because this takes us on to the this probably dates between 1200 and 1300. So we would have had our early churches, we had Viking visitors coming to pay a few visits and to take what they could. We have a record of 950 approximately of Viking boats on Loch Corrib. The Vikings are very well noted for not being stopped by a bit of land in their way. they would have carried boats over land using rollers. So to say that they weren't on Loch Mask, you know, so they were around the period. If there was any riches around here, they probably would have taken them very, very easily. They formed our cities, so around the coast. Dublin in particular was a Viking settlement with people going over and back to Norway and Denmark and places like that. Okay, this is our next wave of visitors. Shortly after this period, or in or around, you notice this baptismal font, and it's what I would call quite crude. Okay, not very decorated, not very carved. Again, it's that transition phase from the Irish church into some of the big monastic orders that started to come in with the Anglo-Normans. So this is the in-between period. Was it broken deliberately? It's broken very evenly. Might have just been taken out and dropped, possibly, okay? But it was found in two halves. I think there was a piece of it visible, and then when they excavated, they found the second bit, and they were very excited, because normally you find one bit of something, you very rarely find the other part of it. So that's why it's here. If you look into it for our visitors, you can see there's little lines to, and probably maybe a wooden bung. It could be drained after a period of time, but there's little drainage channels inside. So while it's rough, it has been worked on the outside, hasn't been carved. We don't get that carving until that period into Anglo-Norman. Generally, there may be much cruder carvings. You probably have seen them in different other locations, but much more sophisticated design of churches started to come in. Okay, so Ross Hill would probably still have been used as a church, probably up till penal times. So what happened in penal times? And any of your young people, do you know when penal times came, you couldn't practice your religion, you couldn't have a church or anything, and very often masses were said outdoors. Okay, so we have a record of Lug na Gunnan, Hollow of the Cannons. Okay, you know where the strip of forestry runs out onto Binlefa top here, where there's a car park? You know where I'm talking about? Just beside an old mill, another part of our history. Just up at the top of that is where there is supposed to be a mass rock. When you stand there, you've an incredible, even though you're not quite up high, you've an incredible view out over the countryside. And again, that would be very typical of where they might have had to disperse. And they have a landscape back behind them around Loch Coolan where they could have dispersed into the the background and disappeared very quickly. Okay. The next indicator that we might have had a church elsewhere is probably as the penal laws were beginning to loosen a little bit and people began to be allowed to practice their faith. Up beside where Fearrick's pub is and where the car park of Lynch's, there was apparently a thatched cottage with its gable out onto the road, and that's where they said mass there at different times. Okay, and then we have the first map in 1838 shows a church in Clonbur. Now this is interesting that it shows this church because I'll pass some of those around and I'll hold one. Okay. And pass that one. Pass those around. Okay. Oh, that's a different map actually showing the that Fair Hill was still being used on the wild map. Okay. So if we see the church here, notice where the entrance, the doorway, is facing out that way. Okay, see that? Okay. Now the map shows that there was a Catholic church here in 1838. The bits of folk record that I got, and I think Ignatius Burke, I don't know if any of the Burkes are here, but Ignatius was very collecting a lot of the local lore, and he put it together in bits and pieces. He suggests that this church was built in 1848. Okay? 1848 is quite significant because in that period we have the suggestion, now I think the church was here already, but I think happened in 1848 that we had the famine period, and to relieve the distress in the area, the government were given grants, and Lady Elizabeth Clemens was significant because she built All Saints Church. And she seems to have been instrumental in drawing down some of the funding, probably to upgrade. This might have been a very simple structure, and then it was built on a little bit. Father Walter Conway, in a latter period, helped draw down funds. He went fundraising. Now I have two sources. One says he went fundraising in America, the other that he went fundraising in England. Okay. In about the 1850s or thereabouts, 1860s. So he is responsible for what they call the cruciform shape, the shape of the cross. So he obviously significantly altered it. And obviously it's been upgraded since. This porch probably didn't exist until, anybody know that? 67, yeah. So there you go. I'm encouraging, and I'll be saying it again at the talk on Sunday, that we start a local heritage group. We have so much heritage, we should be looking at gathering all of this stuff. We are unfortunately losing a lot of our older population. I'd like to acknowledge Kieran Burke. He would have been somebody that I would have wanted out in this talk today, just because of his knowledge, and I think it's important that we do it now and try to talk to people and gather the information as much as we can. So that's a little bit more about the church history, but again it relates to why Clonbur is the important village in the locality. It had the business, and it had the ecclesiastical, and it had the lovely countryside. Okay, people back in the 1800s were not looking at the countryside for views. Okay, they were attempting to survive, and I'll read out when we go back up into the square. I'll talk about Kay's, the back end of Kay's house was the courthouse in Clonbur. We do have dates of 1840, I think I'll just check it again, 1843 for the courthouse being built. We think the crane house was probably built in around the same period. Okay, there is confusion because there was an Elizabeth Clemens Senior and Elizabeth Clemens Junior. Now Elizabeth Clemens Junior was definitely responsible for All Saints Church, and she lived in Rosshill, which was beginning to fall into a little bit of disrepair for about 10 years. And again, I have that recorded on a paper, which I'm going to take all your email addresses and give out to you. I'm laughing because this morning we had a technical meltdown at Petersburg. I probably also had a bit of a meltdown because all my notes and all the stuff that I had done, so you can imagine I'm here talking out of my head and trying to remember all the stuff. But the reason, we have a lot of digital sources, newspapers. I was talking to Bernie about that. The Ballinrobe Chronicle seemed to have existed from about the 1850s, and it carried a lot of history, which I'll talk about. You know, there's a huge amount of sources out there. Sometimes people just need direction, and then you can go off and do your own research. In some of those newspapers, local names are mentioned, and so if you want to research your ancestors, your family, again, it's a way of finding out what they were up to, good and bad. Let me advise and warn you. Okay, but it's always, I think, the program Who Do You Think You Are? It's always fascinating because even though you may find that you had somebody that ended up in prison or went bankrupt or whatever, that adds to the stories. So I don't think we should ever be ashamed or upset when we find something, because in that period what astonishes me is how difficult life was. They were surviving from potato harvest to potato harvest. there was periods called the lean months where the last of the potatoes were used up and they had very little food until the new potatoes started to appear. So we've got to be very aware of that irregardless of what we think, you know, we've a very privileged life today. Okay, so we go down to...
Trish, on that there on the map,
yes, sorry.
was this a road?
No, that's the boundary, townland boundaries.
All right, okay.
Yeah. So this was the road. So the roads still seem to be more or less the same, okay?
Yeah.
A lot of the roads, back to Clough-Brack, the roads, they started claiming relief schemes after the famine, and there was a lot of investment in roads. When the Momtrasna murders happened, you could not get into that area of Finney by road. They crossed from Ballinroad by boat. So just to kind of give you an idea, the ferry bridge and Father Lavelle, to my knowledge, was responsible for getting the ferry bridge built. Okay, we still call it a ferry bridge. You actually think about it, ferry bridge, but it's an indicator that the ferry was there. We built a bridge subsequently.
If you look at the old Ordnance Survey maps of like not that long ago, it shows no bridge. It shows the gap is much wider. Apparently the Somervilles used to run the ferry.
Yes.
My father used to say that it was 2 women, but I don't know whether that's right.
Yeah. Father Lavelle had a falling out with Lord Ordelon of Ashford Castle because he attempted to put in a temporary sort of bridge, and Ordelon sued him for interfering with his property. So just goes to show you. Again, that's recorded out of the Ballinroad Chronicle. Okay.
Is that how the county boundary changed?
Yes, boundaries changed and so on would change in that period as well.
You know the things that the guy who was up in the church, the All Saints last year, he gave out a thing and with the landholders, and one of them was a man called Somerville, and that he owned land there with a tenant, and also with a tenant of the ferry.
Okay.
So that's in that
little booklet,
record,
yeah. So just to remind you folks, on Sunday at 2:30, remind me his name, Adrian. Steve Dolan gave a very interesting talk last year and is coming back, and again he's going to deal a lot with the newspapers. I'm going to refer to a little bit, but he's talking about the amount of history that's in the newspapers. So whatever I've covered today will give you a good setting for that. We also have part of the place name project that over at Kernamona, they're looking at gathering field names and place names. Hugely important record as well to do that, because again they're being lost. If we don't do it, and in fact we probably have lost to a certain amount. I know Stephen Canning, Tommy Crussey, that they would have been very important people for knowing a lot of place names and significant locations. It was Stephen Canning that took Porrick Canning to Lugnagonnell, so that we actually know where that location is. And so we might have had it as a record, because I've come across it in research, we might know where exactly the location was. So we head on down, next up Titanic, ladies, if you want to